Hello and welcome to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. What I'm going to do is walk through a paper on an educational intervention in osteopathy, and it is from the most recent issue of the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. So I believe this would be the winter 24 or maybe January 24 edition. I may be misquoting that. Something that I just want to note is if you are interested in attempting to stay on top of what's going on in a particular field with respect to research, you can definitely set up sort of list type alerts. So you can choose particular journals and you can set up varying alert mechanisms so that you can see titles and abstracts and you can kind of go and look at them. You may not always have full access to the text, as is the case with this one. So what I'm going to do when I'm looking at this paper is not going to be completely representative of the paper itself, just because I can't get behind the paywall at this point. There's no appropriate access for me. But there are, and I'll show this to you, there's different sites that will host it that will provide you just the abstract, and sometimes they'll provide you a little bit more. It's going to depend on the particular site that is hosting the article. The article originates from the same journal, but the way that the sites host it, they have different standards, so they'll give you different pieces of information. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen. So for those who are only listening, you obviously won't see this, and for those who are listening, you'll be fine. Or for those who are only listening, I will do my best to describe it. As I trip over my words, please excuse me. So the article, the title of the article is "A Tailored Training Based on Students and Teachers' Needs to Improve Palpation Skills, a Quantitative Part of a Mixed Method Study." So this was published December 13th, 2023. So what I have up on the screen is the way that the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine presents this on their own site, and what you'll see is highlights. So they give the highlights, they give the abstract, keywords, references, and whatnot, right? But that's the way that they set it up. So sometimes if you want a little bit more insight into the paper, you can just copy the title at least and paste it into a search engine, and then other options will pop up. And the one that I have pulled up now is from Science Direct, or I do not know how to say this properly. I don't know if it's Elsevier, I really don't know how to properly pronounce it, but it's Elsevier. They are essentially the largest publisher of scientific journals, as far as I know. Now, this one, if you look at the screen as it stands, and I'll describe it, you'll see there's the abstract, the introduction, and section snippets. So these section snippets can give you a little bit more insight above and beyond the abstract itself. So you can get a little bit more insight. And one of the challenges is that many articles are behind paywalls. Not all, it depends on the agreement between the journal and the author group. And I do think there are different ways that people will make, or that author groups or journals will provide free access to things, but I'm not 100% sure how that works. Anyways, so what we're going to do is read through this, and I'll editorialize as I go. So essentially, I'm drawing on not only what's in the paper, but my knowledge of educational strategies as well. And I would like to note before I do anything else that this is actually, I think, a useful article in certain ways. In other ways, I think there's more that could be done, but that's one of the benefits of things being available to be examined and discussed, right? So not everybody sees the same thing the same way. Not everybody will ask the same question. So cumulatively, we will get further towards an accurate representation of what's going on, as opposed to just one group doing it or one individual doing it. So the fact that I'm making any form of editorialization on this is mainly in the aims of pointing out areas where more stuff could be done. So I'll read the highlights here. To our knowledge, this is the first study that uses a mixed method design to create a training tailored based students and teachers expectations. I think there's a minor typo there. I think there's a word missing. That's fine. The mixed methods, it means you have a quantitative portion, so a portion that has something that has a measurable construct, in the sense that converted to numbers, right? So a construct is essentially a thing that is it and is identifiably not anything else. Quantitative data takes a qualitative thing and then assigns a number-based system to provide relative information, right? Maybe a better way to say this is that an inch, it is a number, like 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches. Those are numbers, but it's an agreed upon standardized scale that is describing a quality, and that quality is length. So we have the construct of length, right? Then we have the construct of an inch versus, say, a centimeter, right? An inch is an agreed upon distance that is standardized, and it is describing length. Centimeters can also do this, and we have ways to mathematically make those things, or make somebody who uses one scale understand the other scale. But all that said, an inch is a quality. So a shoelace can be an inch, a stick can be an inch, a finger can be an inch, a hair can be an inch. The inch is the shared quality that is described in a standardized way. However, I noted something such as a shoelace, a hair, a finger, a stick. These are all completely separate things, so we would need another construct to understand them. But what you're trying to do when you're doing quantitative work essentially is get to a standardized, agreed upon scale to describe a quality so that you can then attempt to find information that's a little bit more abstract through mathematical interpretation or mathematical analysis. Qualitative information is simply the descriptions of something, right, without the conversion to a standardized, agreed upon scale. That said, when you're doing qualitative analysis, you're looking for things that repeat. So whether it's a word that repeats, or it really is a word that repeats because it's the description, but you're looking for the repeating words or the words that are very, very similar to one another that you will then meld into a category. So you're doing a similar thing, whether it's qualitative or quantitative analysis, you're looking for similarities. Qualitative analysis, you're probably working before at the stage before you could find a phenomenon that's stable enough that it could be transmuted or altered into a standard scale, right? So anyways, lots of rambling to try to give some more insight into how qualitative and quantitative are more similar than they sound, right? It depends on the constructs you're using. It depends on the scales that you're using. There's a lot of things at play there, and you really need to attempt to figure that out as opposed to just saying it's numbers or it's words, right? Qualitative and quantitative are not as different as they may sound in standard descriptions. So to return to reading the highlights, the tailored training includes both an overview of theoretical knowledge and a practical approach. This training allows peer-to-peer learning experience, helping Osteopathic schools in decreasing the number of tutors requested for a practical lesson. So with respect to, say, what the author group would be attempting to pitch here, is there is a method that can decrease overhead for a school, right? If you decrease overhead for a school or you decrease the amount of tutors required, then scheduling load goes down or scheduling challenges go down, monetary challenges go down to an institution. The study suggests that during practical lessons, the use of groups composed by 3 students from different classrooms can improve comparison between peers and enhances their critical thinking. The term critical thinking, I will just highlight that as a term that I have major challenges with, as I have described in previous podcasts. So you can go look at those. Critical thinking is not a thing. It's thinking. Critical thinking is only a thing in philosophy. Philosophy allows for what is considered acceptable conclusions in the absence of evidence. So, that may not be fair with respect to what I'm saying about critical thinking, but when people attempt to identify stable phenomenon, when cognitive psychologists attempt to identify stable phenomenon, there's no stable phenomena that could fall into the myriad of definitions that exist for critical thinking. Anyways, I'm going to read the abstract now. Background. Palpation is a fundamental and complex skill for manual practitioners. It is a very difficult task to teach and to learn. Trials suggest that training might increase the reliability of palpation in detection of bony landmarks. Nevertheless, the poor dependability of the examined test suggests that teaching methods must be reviewed. different training methodologies have been implemented to improve learning experience of manual therapists, but none of them were based on students and teachers' suggestions. So to look first, trials suggest that training might increase the reliability of palpation and detection of bony landmarks. Nevertheless, the poor dependability of examined tests suggests that teaching methods must be reviewed. I don't know that that's the appropriate conclusion. If no matter what level of skill you examine practitioners at, if there is consistent issues with identifying bony landmarks, you may come to a different conclusion and suggest that there may not, first of all, it may be a difficult thing to do, period. So difficult, in fact, that there may be less value than one would hope. Identifying a bony landmark is not a treatment method. It may put you in the area of what you assume you want to touch, but realistically, the tests in osteopathy are movement-based tests. They are not static-based tests. A lot of osteopathic practitioners will do static landmarking, but they don't work with static landmarking. They work with movement, such that I would argue that maybe a more appropriate conclusion, based on the evidence available, is if you think that better teaching will do it, and there has been a wide variety of teaching methods that have not improved the accurate identification of bony landmarks, you may be attempting to bark up the wrong tree, metaphorically speaking. What may be more appropriate is to simply say that if we assay what osteopathic practitioners do in practice, that static landmarking is something they're taught to do and they repeat consistently, but it has way less clinical value than motion-based testing. So maybe you could simply conclude, hey, this might not be the thing to keep doing, right? Maybe we could get rid of palpation altogether, or not palpation. That's incorrect to say. Maybe we could get rid of having at the high end of a hierarchy that bony landmark identification is of high clinical value, right? So maybe we could change the hierarchy and say that the bony landmark is less important than the motion. The motion is more important, right? That would be my initial argument from that. Different training methodologies, to return to make commentary, different training methodologies have been implemented to improve learning experience of manual therapists, but none of them were based on students and teacher suggestions. I want to highlight learning experience, improve learning experience. Learning experience may likely point to reported satisfaction. Reported satisfaction is an interesting thing. Many institutions are very interested in it. I would say that that is important, but it's important as a customer service construct. A satisfied student, or a student who is satisfied with teaching methods, is of less value practically than a student who, as an alternate construct, shows high levels of competence. You would really want them to exist at the same time, but they are separate constructs. A satisfied student and a skilled student don't have to be the same thing. The customer service element that I'm talking about is very, very important for institutions. If institutions are constantly having negative experience between the institution and the student, then the students will share that information with prospective students, and the institution will have a problem with recruiting and maintaining student population. So it's an important construct. Student satisfaction, learning experience is an important construct. It's exceptionally important. It's absolutely required to run an institution. However, it's probably not the thing that you want to base a teaching method on. Your teaching method should much more ideally be based on performance outcomes. So you have to figure out what the performance outcomes are, how you would measure them, and get that. Now, at the same time as getting that, or optimizing for performance outcomes, you can simply not be a jerk. Don't be rough on your students. Be pleasant to them, engage them, be a decent human being. And usually your learner experience will be quite positive. Now, to finish off that sentence, learning experience of manual therapists, but none of them were based on students and teachers' suggestions. So what they're noting is that previous interventions or attempts to interventions were based on, say, educational research. not necessarily on what the students or the teachers were expressing themselves, right? You definitely get a long way from asking the person who's having a challenge what their challenge is, because sometimes their ability to express it is not necessarily ideal. They won't say it the right way where somebody will hear it and do the right thing. So sometimes you have to ask a bunch of people and try to figure out what the heck is going on so that you can sort of triangulate or zero in on what the deficit is. Once you understand what the deficit is, you can then translate it into different conceptual language and then teach to it. So one of the things with good teaching is that the underlying concept will often have to be expressed in a variety of ways. This leads well into looking at the concept of far transfer, and far transfer essentially being the ability to utilize a non-tangible abstract concept such as a conceptual framework, a problem-solving framework, but something that's non-tangible and omnipresent in varying situations. And the best way to teach to that is explicitly say what the non-tangible abstract concept is and provide a minimum of 2 examples to improve learning outcomes, right? So most of what the fundamental angle that this author group is looking at could probably be well dealt with by working with a far transfer paradigm as well as paying attention to learners in the moment, how they're expressing. Because if you're working in that far transfer paradigm, you recognize that things are abstract. So the challenge that one individual may have will look very different than the challenge somebody else is having, or they look like they're having, but maybe they're the same challenge. So it's really kind of digging into that more abstract thing. So to move on, the objectives of this study aims to find an efficient training tailored on students' needs that improves students' palpatory skills. So I think they've got a few more balls in the air than they need to. They may be juggling a few too many things. That's okay. At least they're trying. It's fantastic to try, because this is how you iron things out and maybe get more towards what you're actually looking for. The improving students' palpatory skills. So what you have to do is you have to have an underlying assumption of what a performance-based outcome for palpatory skills is. Now we look back at what we've already seen, and we see that it's identification of bony landmarks, right? Now, as we go on, it's not simply identification of bony landmarks, it's identification of static asymmetry with paired bony landmarks. Okay, so there's a design mixed method study, so it's quantitative and qualitative. Methods. So I'll read the methods. The study was divided into 4 phases: 2 quantitative, 2 qualitative. Pelvis asymmetries were valued by 112 students from the Accademia Italiana di Medicina, I think it's Medicina, Osteopatica, Osteopathic Institute, using 2 bony landmarks: the greater trochanter, GT, and the posterior superior iliac spine, PSIS. The volunteers had a hidden wedge of 2 centimeters under their heel using a randomization process. 9 students and 3 teachers were interviewed to explore their lived learning experiences. A tailored learning of, now I'm going to pause here. The 9 students and 3 teachers interviewed, so that's the qualitative side. You have 112 students doing the palpation. You have 9 students and 3 teachers interviewed. That can look like a problem with numbers, but there's a term in qualitative research called sufficiency. You interview, and you'll have an interview guide, but your interview will change based on what you're collecting. So it's kind of what you'd call an iterative or a living process. It changes as you go. But sufficiency is essentially when you have interviewed a multitude of people and no new themes show up. So when you're getting no new themes, you've kind of got to the end of what you're going to find, or at least that is the built-in methodological assumption. So very low number of students, very low number of teachers, but they probably got to a point, and they're not reporting on sufficient or on the qualitative side here. So we can't comment on it from what's said here, but they probably got to sufficiency pretty quickly. The same themes came up and no new themes emerged, or no new themes presented, maybe a better way to say it. To go back to reading, a tailored training of 1 hour was implemented based on their suggestions. So I believe that would mean the suggestions of the 9 students and 3 teachers. To go back to reading, students were then randomly divided into 3 training groups. Tailored training, PALPATE, is an acronym. and no training. A second data collection was performed. Students were reevaluated, asked to make another assessment of another volunteer. 2 students and 1 teacher were then re-interviewed to assess if the tailored training met their expectations. A generalized linear model was used to analyze the data. With respect to the methods and the re-interview, again, I can't see the qualitative reporting here. There might be a problem with that with respect to asking if it met your expectations. Qualitative interviewing really depends on the skill of the interviewer and how robust the interview guide is. So there could be a challenge methodologically, but I'm not going to be too picky, especially because I can't see it. Anyways, we'll go into the results. 76 students completed the trial. Generally, correct detections of higher landmarks increased from the first to the second data collection, except for fifth-year students who decreased their performances. Tailored training achieved the best results with the correct detection of the greater trochanter by 69% of students and for posterior superior iliac spine by 78% of students. The generalized linear model showed a strong association between correct detection of PSIS and training type. The p-value is 0.009. Essentially, what that's attempting to say is this is not random chance. Over time, p-value of 0.01. But no association with year of school, p-value of 0.434. So yeah, but that could just be random chance. No association between year of study, the p-value of 0.228, training types, p-value of 0.267, and correct GT detection over time, p-value of 0.529 was found. So there was more information, more accurate identification of the elevation of PSIS based on the 2-centimeter wedge than there was of the greater trochanter. So that probably is not a strange thing as far as static palpation or palpation of bony landmarks with respect to static asymmetry. The greater trochanter has way more freedom of movement because there are multiple joints that will impact what it's doing. The coxofemoral joint can do a lot of stuff, especially when there's a wedge, because the coxofemoral joint, like the femur, can move to accommodate the wedge. The knee can bend. The ankle is doing something different on that side. Whereas the PSIS really is not a moving bony landmark. It is kind of welded in to the pelvis as a complex, despite what osteopathic practitioners and many other hands-on practitioners want to say, that the PSIS does all this moving. But the PSIS as a bony landmark, first of all, it's statically asymmetric anyways in most people because they're not exactly the same. But it's much more localized when you do find it, whereas the greater trochanter has a wide normal range of asymmetrical shape bilaterally in people based on many things such as growth and use patterns. And depending on how you teach somebody to landmark it, it's really easy for them to just screw up their hands, right? They can do stuff like this. They can do stuff like, there's all kinds of ways you can screw that up. The greater trochanter as a specified landmark is kind of too big, especially for static asymmetry, whereas the PSIS might be more trustworthy for static asymmetry. So that's not surprising. I don't know if they go into that as a possible explanation, but it would be a valuable one to consider, that maybe if you're trying to identify static asymmetry, the landmarks need to be very localized, maybe small, maybe pointed, and they need to not move that much. If they move a lot, then it's really hard to pick them out. Whereas the ASIS and the PSIS, they may be quite reasonable for static asymmetry. It's not a strange thing to do, but that's not a generalizable skill to other bony landmarks. It's not it doesn't seem like in any way a generalizable skill to the greater trochanter, right? So that would be some superficial information that would be the beginning of me having confidence that attempting to detect static asymmetry of the greater trochanter is just not worthwhile as a test. Okay? That's, again, the editorialization and an example of how you can take observed data and build another hypothesis on it, right? So A way to deal with that would be you choose, say, uh, AC joints or acromion, like you essentially choose the AC joint or you choose the SC joint. You choose the greater trochanter, you choose the patella, you choose the fibular head, then you choose the PSIS and the ASIS, and then you set up something that's going to make all of those things asymmetrical. You collect all that data, and then you can start to see the general characteristics of bony landmarks that are more amenable to identifying static asymmetry and the ones that aren't, right? So there's probably bony landmarks that are not amenable to identifying static asymmetry. That's just probably the case. And you could figure that out. So the way that you would test it is you test them all. You'd build in your static asymmetry or whatever it is that does notably make them asymmetric. You see how well people can find it, and then the data will show you whether or not it's amenable to that test. So it would show you whether it's even a useful test to use. I would simply suggest that it's probably not that useful a test to use in most circumstances. Static asymmetry really just doesn't give you that much information that you're going to treat, right? It's the shape of a bone and the location of it, as opposed to how it moves in relation to all of the other structures. To finish the abstract, conclusions: tailored training was shown to be effective and useful in the improvement of students' performance, especially for posterior superior iliac spine. Interest levels played an important role in correct detection. So that interest level part, if the students are interested and engaged, they're probably going to put more effort into working. So there's things like motivation and attention, the optimal theory of motor learning. So learning motor skills, it's optimizing for attention and learning. That's what optimal is. And there's three characteristics: external focus of attention, enhanced expectancy. So the enhanced expectancies is the part that you can do some really interesting stuff with. The positive social comparison is one. So if people have positive experiences when they're learning something, it seems to maintain motivation, and it seems to maintain, that's what it is. I have to go back to the acronym optimal. Optimizing motivation and attention for learning. I think I said that, but I don't know if I did. Anyways, if people are having a positive experience when learning, often they'll stay engaged, and then sometimes you could say that they just get more repetition so that the learning improves, or sometimes the engagement and the attention helps the learning. So there's different ways to go about hypothesizing as to how that works, but it seems to work. And then you have AS. EE is enhanced expectancies. EF is external focus of attention, and AS, I don't remember what it is. I can't remember that off the top of my head. It doesn't really matter that much. But this is where that customer service concept actually comes into play in learning mechanisms. If you're generally positive to learners, then they're less likely to get turned off, is probably the best way to say it. Learners will succeed even if you're rough on them, but that's not because of being rough on them. It's because motivated students will go home and learn on their own anyways. So if you fundamentally believe that part of your mix of teaching is being rough on students, you're just plain wrong, because the students do most of the learning at home anyways, even when you're positive to them. Being positive to them isn't necessarily something that is going to actively boost performance. It's much more likely that it's not going to actively decrease engagement, right? So you're not, by being positive to them, you're not necessarily improving performance. What you're doing is you're not deterring them. That might be a better way to frame it conceptually. So we got through the abstract. I don't really need to go through the rest of it to improve the point I'm trying to make. Generally speaking, looking at that paper in the abstract form, so it's not complete, it's not showing the qualitative side, so we have to freely admit that, which means that any commentary is limited by that reality. Asking students what they like is a way to improve engagement, or what they want or what they think they need. It's a way to improve engagement. It's not the only way to improve engagement, but it is a way to improve engagement. If the conclusions based on the methodology from this paper are essentially to be assumed and believed, then what you would think is you'd have to repeat that process, train them, ask them what they like, retrain them, or try training them, ask them what they like, and then compare the groups, right? And then the one group comes out on top. I don't think it's the method so much as it's the phenomenon. The phenomenon is improved engagement. The phenomenon is not the methodology that they undertook, if that makes sense. So it's not the way they did it. The details are not the thing that probably helped performance. The thing that probably helped performance was that the PSIS doesn't move much, and when it's asymmetrical based on a wedge, it's detectable. The greater trochanter, that's just not a thing. So the spaces the structures they chose, probably one is amenable to that identification and the other one is not. But it's not necessarily the use of the specific suggestions, it's the process of engagement that might be better. That's actually hard to say because not all that many students were involved in the engagement process. So that's a little fuzzy. But the if there is some sense that a group is being listened to and engaged with, then that probably does a lot. You can do that in a lot of different ways, and you can do that maybe on a more individual basis throughout a room. The one thing that they did do that was really interesting that I didn't necessarily touch on, and I should, is working in groups of three. Near peer teaching and near peer feedback is quite robust and quite powerful. What you have is three different people with three different thoughts on the same thing, even though they overlap well. They'll be able to each see a slightly different angle that the other people in the group can't see. So that improves understanding by comparison. It's essentially an accidental form of identification or error identification because they may not each know the error itself, but by contrasting and comparing between one another, they'll figure out what works the best. So that's a tried, tested, and true method. So the groups of three, especially if they're at slightly different levels, they don't have to be at different levels. They just have to be different than one another. That is quite helpful for improving learning outcomes because it's an easy way to build in error identification without having to include a lot of training. And then that relates back to the ability to reduce the amount of tutors required because the students are comparing notes or comparing thoughts and processes. So it's a really powerful, robust thing. So the things at play here as abstract concepts that are omnipresent or aka far transfer are engagement, and the engagement doesn't necessarily improve performance, but it doesn't deter performance. It doesn't disengage people. So that's important. The working in groups of peers harnesses the phenomenon of near peer teaching. And this is relatively well understood in educational processes. So if you leverage that in osteopathic training, you can get a very positive result. Many osteopathic schools probably already do this, maybe just not in a formalized way. It's probably not built into how they engage and how they teach. It wouldn't be strange to see upper year students specifically tutoring or monitoring under or lower year students. That's completely normal. You see that in all kinds of healthcare education, but purposely generating skill development, hands-on skill development in small groups is something that maybe they don't do consistently or they don't leverage as well as they could. So that's me wandering through a paper, showing the process of analyzing a paper based on the abstract and completely admitting that not all the information is there, as well as from the information that's present, generating possible hypotheses to explain in a way that could be falsified the findings, as well as to possibly open up new areas. And that process can very much be helpful in further investigation in all fields. And that's why open dialogue with respect to research is very important. And it also should leverage not being a jerk. There's a way to talk about findings that doesn't generate defensiveness and in total generates more insight from different angles that can be considered. And that's the same phenomenon as working in small groups. It's kind of a happy accident that's going to happen no matter what you do, as long as you're not pissing each other off. So There are definitely things that bother me about the profession, and I do communicate those, but I lean into trying to do that in a way that doesn't generate too much nuisance or defensiveness. I can be pretty rough. Uh, that's just me rambling about myself, which doesn't really matter under the circumstances. But the open dialogue improving the knowledge base of a profession is essentially very similar as a fundamental phenomenon to working in small groups. So hopefully that gave you some insight into the process of looking through a paper, understanding what you can, hypothesizing, and kind of working through that. So hopefully that's a decent example of that. And thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.